Why did the US EPA find that glyphosate did not cause cancer?
The person in charge of the evaluation of glyphosate was Jess Rowland. He was Monsanto's lapdog. He's the one that said to his Monsanto handler, if he could stop this other agency from doing a glyphosate carcinogenicity test, he should get a medal. He was described by the executives as someone that was very beneficial to Monsanto. He was the subject of a letter. A letter came from Marianne Copley, a 30-year veteran, senior toxicologist at the EPA, who had to leave because she had cancer. She wrote him a fiery letter basically acknowledging that he was changing the outcome of reports to benefit the companies, that he was doing things just to get his bonuses, that he was incompetent to evaluate carcinogenicity, that one of his colleagues was probably taking bribes, and she urged him to finally do something right once in his life. But it fell on deaf ears because he was Monsanto's lapdog. So he was in charge of the committee, and what did he do? He picked the studies to evaluate that were designed and run by Monsanto, or at least paid for by Monsanto. And we know what they do. We know how they rig the research. I could talk for an hour on how Monsanto rigs research. It's absolutely pathetic. And when the International Agency for Research on Cancer did their evaluation, they did peer-reviewed published public studies.
Why aren't more studies being done to convincingly show the effects from eating GMO food versus non-GMO foods?
Who will pay? Who will pay for those studies? More than 90% of all the research on GMOs are paid for by the biotech industry. I was told by Professor Elaine Ingham that hundreds of scientists were deterred from doing any GMO research because of what happens to those who do. And what happens to those is they get bullied, threatened, they lose funding, they lose tenure, they get forced out of their positions. We've seen it time and time again. I interview a lot of them. These are often high-profile poster children that are used as examples of what would happen if you dare to do studies on GMO and find that there's a problem. And even if you want to do a study, you need to get access to the seeds. And there's patents that make it very difficult to legally access the seeds. There was a letter signed by 26 entomologists complaining that it was very difficult to do independent research on GMOs because they weren't accessing the seeds. And oftentimes, if they did get permission, it was with a contract that the biotech company could review the data and decide whether it was going to be published.
You touched on some. What health issues seem the most correlated with eating GMO foods?
I can tell you that the number one is digestive problems, according to our survey. Digestion, this is in terms of self-reporting, fatigue, obesity, brain fog, anxiety, depression, and other mood problems, food sensitivity and allergies, and then you get into a bunch of others, pain, joint pain, skin conditions. It includes diabetes, heart disease, gluten sensitivity, menstrual problems, Parkinson's, cancer. All these things are related, but the main ones that I mentioned at the top. Now, that's in terms of self-reporting. But that doesn't mean that that's the most accurate way. There's certain correlations, like we talked about autism. Someone whose child has autism, they may never try and put that autistic child on an organic diet, or the damage may be done so that you need to do a lot more than just switch the diet in order to reverse the damage. So it's not clear based on reports, but I am convinced that digestive disorders are extremely related to GMOs and Roundup.
Do we need GMOs to make crops that can better withstand rising temperatures from climate change?
Crops that are drought tolerant, heat tolerant, those require, and also higher yield, those require the interaction of many genes, not just a single gene. We haven't yet cracked the code to be able to actually create effective drought tolerant, heat tolerant, higher yield crops through genetic engineering. What works far better is selective breeding. Now you can use the methodologies of genetic engineering to help selective breeding go along more quickly. If you identify which genes are successful at, say, withstanding certain temperatures, when you cross all these different crops together, you can take little pieces of the offspring and find out which ones have those genes, and then you can cross those and find out which ones have those genes. So as you're developing your variety, you can speed it along if you, what's called marker-assisted selection. You're not genetically engineering the plant. You're just seeing which plants that were created from natural selection have the genes you're looking for. So it speeds up the process of creating the ones that you're looking for, of creating the traits. But one of the issues is the biodiversity. When there's so much biodiversity in the food supply, etc., then you'll often have farmers in drought-stricken areas, in hot areas, with the seeds that can do it, and you just grow out those if there's a shift. What problem we have with the current monoculture and the way that our food supply is that we've eliminated the biodiversity from so many of these crops. Now we have some of them preserved in seed banks, but there should be an effort to grow them out and introduce them so that we end up starting to create the biodiversity that was there 100 and 200 years ago. And then we'll have the security to do what we need to do in times of climate change, drought, flood, etc.
Is there reason to believe glyphosate strips minerals from the body? Why does it matter if we have less minerals?
Glyphosate was originally patented to strip the minerals off of the walls of boilers and pipes because it's a chelator. It's the most active chelator, just grabs on all these minerals. And what it does is it makes plants mineral deficient. It makes the animals that eat the Roundup and Roundup-ready crops mineral deficient. It makes us mineral deficient. Minerals are cofactors in biochemical pathways. So to make it clear, you hire a foreman, you hire all the people, you have all the tools, you're ready to build the house, but no one does anything. They're all on strike until the mineral shows up and says, go. Without the mineral, nothing happens. All these different biochemical pathways are idle without these minerals. Mineral deficiency is linked to dozens or hundreds of diseases, depending on who you talk to. And sometimes the application of minerals in the diet that are absorbable can reverse diseases. So it actually is a huge piece of health. And I have a Healing from GMOs and Roundup online conference. I was speaking to Dr. Lee Cowden, who creates protocols for other doctors as his profession. And he said he's been testing minerals with patients and realizes that the American population needs more minerals now every year because of the Roundup causing the chelation or grabbing onto minerals, making them unavailable.
Are Roundup sprayed crops deficient in nutrients? Do the GMO fields have a lower amount of nutrients than those same crops grown in the non-GMO fields?
Well, certainly they have less minerals because of the mineral chelation. But a friend of mine went to two different fields side by side, walked in a certain number of rows, walked down a certain number of plants, picked some corn, got it tested, and the minerals in the GM corn were abysmal. Sometimes 10, 40 times less. It was just ridiculous, absolutely devoid of nutrients. And it had formaldehyde, so, which is a carcinogen, among other things.
Who approved GMOs in the first place, and why did they approve GMOs if they were health and environmental concerns?
The Bush administration was convinced that GMOs were going to help increase U.S. exports and decrease a trade deficit. So the Council of Competitiveness run by Dan Quayle was trying to shore up U.S. exports, and he declared in the Indian Treaty Building in the room in the White House on May of 1992 that they were going to not impose regulations on GMOs that would hamper the production. And 2 days later, this hands-off policy created by Michael Taylor at the FDA was announced. Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president. So the purpose was to increase U.S. exports. The opposite happened. Purpose was to increase U.S. control of the food supply. The opposite happened. But the White House had instructed the FDA, EPA, and USDA to promote GMOs. And so that's why you ended up with GMOs in the market that should never have been there.
How can people donate to your nonprofit if they want to support your work?
Thank you for that question. Go to responsibletechnology.org. There's a donate tab, and you can decide whether you want to do it one time, monthly, quarterly, or yearly. If you do it on a recurring basis, then we can count on the money coming through and we can budget accordingly. So we can hire someone to help get the word out to schools, etc. We can hire someone to create a global coalition to alert them. We can create a project that requires money expenditures over several months because we know that we're going to be getting money in the future. So if there's any way that you can do that, that would be wonderful.
Does glyphosate promote leaky gut syndrome, and if so, how?
If you look at a petri dish with human cells and you put in glyphosate, before you put it in, they're all tight together. It's called tight junctions. When you add it, they separate. So yeah, leaky gut. What happens is then the undigested proteins can get through the walls of the gut. The immune system attacks it, and that can create autoimmune disease and inflammation and all sorts of problems.